In the previous entry to this series, one comment that really stuck out to me and grabbed my attention was by Cloud Creation, who I would later find out was a guy by the name of Andrew Murray from Temecula, California. In it, he detailed how his racing career was shot down by a bad sponsorship deal. I hit him up to hear the extended version, and the full story was so much worse than what he had alluded to in that comment. He started go-kart racing at the age of 5 and quickly moved up the ranks, eventually competing with guys by the likes of Sage Karam and Santino Ferrucci, two big players in the IndyCar scene today. He was talented right off the bat, winning races left and right. His dream was to move up to Formula 1, but that was never going to happen. After a quick foray into lower division formula racing in England, it became apparent that an American kid was never going to be accepted into the European market. So he went back home and set his sights on stock car racing, and eventually moved over to Ford Focus midgets and 360 sprint cars. Sponsorship opportunities started rolling in and races filled up his calendar, all with the help of ARCA West team owner Jason Bowles coaching him throughout. Even more wins and accolades started rolling in. At this time, Andrew was only in 8th grade, and had so many sponsorship obligations and races to get to that he missed 100 days of school just that school year alone. But it was paying off. His family was well off, but by no means rich, so they struggled to find money for parts and equipment, but sponsors were definitely helping. However, an early warning was of a falling out between Andrew and Million Energy Drink, who quickly went bankrupt and fell off the face of the earth, leaving a hole in their money supply that was hastily patched up. During his sprint car days, Andrew would build his own 358 small block Chevy motors from the ground up for his car after school, while his dad worked on everything else. Eventually, Mercury Insurance came with a sponsorship offer, and that led to a late model start at Madera Speedway, a 100-lap feature in a multi-class race with super late models and late model stocks mixed in together. Super late models have about 50 more horsepower than a stock, but to everyone's surprise, Andrew, driving a stock, bested the supers and won the race, putting everybody on notice. Mercury doubled down and partnered with an ARCA West team to put up $300,000 for the last 2 races of the year and a full-time ride next year. This was it, the big break Andrew needed to push forward and make it into the top division of NASCAR. However, just before the race, Mercury mysteriously backed out and withheld their funding. Andrew's father would tell him sometime later that it was Sean Bowman, the father of current NASCAR star Alex Bowman, who convinced Mercury to back out because of some beef he had with one of Andrew's car owners. Andrew and his father did what they could but missed the race in Sacramento that night, and struggled to keep the dream alive. Over the course of the next year, Andrew's father sold almost everything he had, even their house, to keep Andrew's racing career going. He clearly had the talent, he just needed one big break to punch his ticket to the big time, but that opportunity never came up. All of this happened 10 years ago, and Andrew Murray has not raced in a professional capacity since. This story is not unique though. Hundreds if not thousands of others could tell you story after story of how their dreams crumbled right in front of them because some misstep or just outright lies. And as the legend Rick Mast put it, everyone in this business has at least one story of not getting paid. So let's take a look at some of the worst liars, thieves, and lawyers to ever disgrace the upper echelons of NASCAR with their presence. This video is sponsored by EJ's Pokeswap. To find out how you can get a hold of some of the most highly sought after vintage Pokemon cards, stay tuned until the end of the video. NASCAR is unlike other sports in that sponsorship dollars aren't just icing on the cake, but are the backbone of a team's income. Sure, race winnings pay out a pretty penny and TV contracts dole out some money too, but even with those two sources, it would require you to win or finish in the top 5 almost every single race and hope to high heaven you didn't wreck your car in the process. Sponsorships bring in the cash to keep the lights turned on, even if you wreck or run mid-pack every week. And with everything hinging on something so crucial, sometimes teams side on the dotted line with a sponsor without doing their due diligence first. Heck, sometimes they'll even boot their driver to the curb if another one comes along with a big sponsorship paycheck to back him. Well, both of those things happened to one very unfortunate team in 1999, when Junie Donlavey's number 90 team suddenly announced that their new driver was going to be Mike Harmon. Harmon these days is a veteran driver with hundreds of starts under his belt in the Xfinity series. But back in 1999, it seemed really odd to tap him for the ride, because he had never made a start in the Cup Series at that point, he had only 6 Xfinity Series starts, and he was being called up all the way from the Slim Jim All-Pro Series, basically the Division 5 feeder series, in which Harmon had only run 1 full season. So why did this old school established team pick Harmon? Well, that's pretty easy, he had the sponsorship dollars already in the bank. His sponsor? Big Daddy's Barbecue Sauce, who are currently flinging sponsorship checks all over the place in just about every form of motorsport in North America. But Donlavey soon found out that Big Daddy was not exactly on the up and up. Although they announced the deal in December of 1998, they could not get the company to sign on the dotted line until mid-January, a full month of dragging their feet. When the 27th of January came around and it was time to get the first check, it bounced. And all the other race teams with Big Daddy deals also started to report missed payments. Now Don Levy was in panic mode because the Daytona 500 is just a couple of weeks away. When the team showed up to Daytona in February, it was in an unsponsored car and Mike Wallace had been tapped at the last second to drive it. At the 11th hour, AccuTurn, a brake and tire company in Virginia, sponsored their car and Mike Wallace managed to bring the car home in 23rd. In the multi-series fallout that ensued, the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, tracked down Big Daddy CEO Dan Lloyd, and he explained that he expected to get $6 million from selling stocks at the company. But his brokerage firm, JB Mark & Associates, had been barred from the securities industry after some chicanery they had tried to pull back in October, trying to run out the back door and sell all the stocks for themselves. So that's why the company didn't pay the teams. The head of JB Mark & Associates would eventually be found guilty of fraud in 2001 and served 6 years in prison. Okay, so Big Daddy Barbecue Sauce wasn't run by a huckster, he got taken advantage of too. By summer of '99, they'd be back sponsoring a few rides in the Truck Series, and by 2000, they were all set to try this NASCAR Cup thing again. They signed with team owner Larry Hedrick to sponsor the number 41 car full-time. The price? 15 million shares of their stock. Wait, no cash? Yeah, Hedrick agreed to take stocks as payment, only to learn that stocks are only worth something if you can sell them, and nobody was buying. By mid-season, Larry was out of money and closed up his shop for good, after nearly a full decade in the sport. Big Daddy's Barbecue Sauce never tried to sponsor another team after that, and by 2005, they were out of business for good. Their name was Mud, but it was unclear if they were at fault for anything. After all, they got screwed by some greedy Wall Street guys and then offered to pay a car owner in stocks, which he agreed to, apparently not knowing how stocks worked. Did Dan Lloyd deserve the heat he got? It's tough to say, but honestly, it just looks like an incredibly misfortunate series of events. We've talked a lot about sketchy sponsors in this series, and by now you might be thinking, to hell with having somebody else finance my race team. What if I was just some crazy billionaire and I wanted to fund a race team purely as a hobby? Doesn't matter if I lose money, I'm just here to have fun and maybe win a few races. Well, that actually has happened a few times. In 2007, Bobby Ginn, a real estate mogul from South Carolina, bought MB2 Motorsports and rebranded it as Ginn Racing. He expanded the team from 2 cars to 3 and had plans on running a 4th. With veteran drivers Mark Martin, Joe Nemechek, and Sterling Marlin filling up the full-time roster slots, and the young, up-and-coming Regan Smith waiting in the wings, they looked pretty good. Mark finished second at the Daytona 500 and is racking up top 5s and top 10s left and right. Meanwhile, Nemechek and Marlin are doing respectable and are fully funded with sponsors for the rest of the year. So Bobby doesn't even have to spend his own money. Nice. Well, hate to break it to you, almost all of Bobby G's sponsors collapsed out of nowhere. Repeatedly, on the weekend of a race, a car would roll off the hauler with one paint job and would abruptly be seen in practice with a default Ginn Resort scheme or just plain black. And oftentimes the driver would still be wearing the fire suit with all of the old sponsors still plastered all over it. So what was the deal here? Well, Bobby was apparently just half-assing sponsorship negotiations. He thought it'd be simple to pull in the big bucks, and when negotiations fell through, he had absolutely no backup plan. Making matters worse was that companies would just back out and he'd act like the deal was still moving forward, telling everybody that everything was fine. Oh well, he's a billionaire, he can afford to run the team out of pocket for a while, right? Nope, wrong again. In August of 2007, he announced, again out of nowhere, that Ginn Racing had merged with Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, and he fired most of his team without warning, leaving Sterling Marlin and Joe Nemechek high and dry with no ride for the Brickyard 400 that weekend. Only Mark Martin's team made it out mostly unscathed. But Sterling and Nemechek were still under contract and had not been paid out, and were left with no option but to sue Ginn for the money they were owed, and their crew chiefs followed suit. Fired employees put their money together and ran a banner plane at Indy that weekend that said, "How much money does Bobby Ginn owe you?" And the whole thing just reeked of corporate fuckery. 124 people lost their jobs, and all because one rich guy found out that running a race team was a lot harder than he had thought. Plus, it turns out he didn't actually have those billions. In 2008, he defaulted on a $675 million loan, and his entire empire was liquidated. He fought legal battles and foreclosures for years afterwards. If you want to know more about this absolute fustercluck of a team that didn't even make it a full season, then you can check out Brock Beard's video aptly titled, "The Beginning of the End." See what he did there? But fair warning, that video is 40 minutes long. It is one hell of a rabbit hole. Alright, so sponsorship woes dogged again, and he wasn't actually a billionaire. What about a guy who actually does have billions in the bank and says, to hell with it, I'll run the whole operation out of pocket? May I introduce you to Red Bull Racing? In Formula 1, most non-factory affiliated teams are actually financed by a single backer, usually that exact type of crazy billionaire we're looking for. The most well-known F1 team that fits this description is Red Bull Racing. The actual energy drink Red Bull does bring in some serious cash, but mostly the company uses Red Bull as a brand the same way Coca-Cola does with their name and logos. It's all kind of complicated, and there's other people that can explain this way better than I can, but suffice it to say, their money's real. In 2007, they're set to enter the world of NASCAR racing, with Red Bull logos being plastered all over their two entrants, the 83 driven by Brian Vickers, and the 84 driven by AJ Allmendinger, two drivers with kind of unimpressive resumes. Vickers has just one win in 3 seasons of competition, and that came from dumping his teammate, and AJ is an open-wheel racer who defects to NASCAR seemingly out of nowhere. They roll into Daytona for the 500 that year and fail to qualify for the season opener, and the rest of the season goes pretty horrendously. With no veteran drivers to stabilize the team, they'd have to wait until 2011 to get their first wins. Vickers at Michigan and Casey Kane driving for the team on a 1-year deal while he waited for a slot to open up at Hendrick. And then, just as soon as they started looking competitive, Red Bull backs out and ends the program. Why is not clearly known. They had lost a lot of money with the organization, but they were just starting to really get the ball rolling. After years of gambling on young, inexperienced drivers like AJ and Scott Speed, they finally have found their groove. One theory is that a sponsor from Red Bull's F1 team influenced the decision: Infiniti, the luxury brand of Nissan. Red Bull's NASCAR program ran Toyotas and worked very closely with Toyota Racing Development, their Motorsports branch. Nissan, who have almost no presence in any motorsport outside of Japan, likely told their one team that they sponsored during contract negotiations, "Hey, we don't really like you running Toyotas over there in America. If you want our money, that has to change." Since Red Bull had only ever lost money on the venture, it was a pretty easy decision to make on their end. But this just leads to more confusion. Teams having cars in multiple series is nothing new, and oftentimes they run cars from opposing manufacturers. Penske at the time ran Dodges in NASCAR, Hondas in IndyCar, and Porsches in the American Le Mans series. At one point, Ganassi ran Chevy Camaros in NASCAR, Ford GTs in IMSA, and Hondas in IndyCar. These car manufacturers largely just never gave a rip what you were doing elsewhere because it was widely understood that it was best not to step on each other's toes. But apparently Nissan just didn't see it that way. Hey, maybe that's why they rarely venture outside of Japan. They just don't understand the unspoken rules in the motorsports landscape. Brian Vickers, after doing his best for Red Bull for 5 seasons, gets kicked to the curb and lands at Michael Waltrip Racing, where he would go on to win a couple more times and enjoyed a steady career until 2013 when Spingate happened, a controversy explained in the first episode where MWR manipulated the end of a race. This caused sponsors to bail and the entire operation would shut its doors by the end of 2015, not winning a single race after their fatal mistake. Vickers would quietly retire, but then he found himself in the crosshairs of a media shitstorm again. This time though, it wasn't him per se. It was his wife, Sarah Kellen, who was allegedly a recruiter for Ghislaine Maxwell, the right-hand woman to Jeffrey Epstein, who was charged with running a child sex trafficking ring and supposedly offed himself while in police custody. This then leads to the obvious question of, was Sarah actually involved in the trafficking of minors, or at least know what was going on? I mean, here she is talking to Epstein. She might have very well known something. And if she did, how did Vickers not have any knowledge of it either? Or was he actually in on the grift? No one knows at the moment but them. However, as soon as the story broke, Vickers went dark on all of his social media accounts and is apparently living a quiet life with his wife as they run an interior decorating company in New York City somewhere. Ghislaine Maxwell is in custody and still alive for the moment, but if she ever decides to start talking and doesn't accidentally shoot herself in the back of the head twice, then Brian Vickers might pop back up into the media again, and for all the wrong reasons. Okay, we've talked about awful sponsors and teams for quite a while in this series, so let's talk about a good sponsor for once. EJ's Pokeswap. EJ's is an eBay store specializing in buying and selling classic Pokemon cards. And full disclosure, I know who these guys are. I've been friends with them for most of my life. But I have to say they have some great stuff and some very rare finds. I even bought a number of cards from them myself. Their descriptions are accurate and the pictures they take are hyper detailed, so when you put the money on the table you know exactly what you're getting. Their sterling eBay rating is proof of this. They're also in the market of buying cards, so if you have some that you're willing to get rid of, you can always hit them up on their Facebook page. They've been going at this for about 1.5 years now, and if you're in the market to start selling cards you no longer want or buying back some childhood nostalgia, it pays to work with somebody who's established in the market. So if that sounds like something that strikes your fancy, check them out in the pinned comment down below. Getting back on track to shady sponsors, one that seemed to immediately raise a lot of suspicions as soon as the car hit the track was the number 28 of H2 Motorsports, sponsored by Circuit City. Wait, hold on, the Circuit City? Didn't they go bankrupt back in 2008? Like, not a restructuring like the permanent kind? Yeah, they did, and all of their assets got liquidated. But whoever got naming rights uses them as an online store only, kind of like Radio Shack still does these days. But as weird as this was, it wasn't the sponsor that got H2 Motorsports into hot water. It was their investor and owner, Matt Hurley. Hurley was an entrepreneur in Florida who burst onto the scene in 2017 with his attempt to renovate some office complexes. But really he had his hands in all types of honey jars: real estate, cryptocurrency, political consulting, and a race team, H2 Motorsports. The number 28 car was piloted by Shane Lee, a promising young driver whose family invested nearly $1 million into the organization. He ran well, finishing outside the top 21 only once, and nabbing a top 10 at Iowa. That's pretty good for a team's first 7 starts ever. As it turned out, their crew was stacked with guys who had been in motorsports for decades. But then suddenly, Shane was fired for, quote, performance issues, and the team never made another start. Hurley had taken all the money from the race team and used it to pay off his ever-mounting debts in other ventures. Turns out he had no clue what he was doing in any of them, and was just robbing Peter to pay Paul. But eventually he ran out of new ventures to create and the jig was up. He's currently being sued by several people for millions of dollars, and has even been charged with contempt of court. But as bad as that sounds, Hurley doesn't hold a candle to the absolute queen of sketchy car owners and general thievery that is Angela Harkness. Let's talk a minute about Angela's motorsports. Born in Iran in 1976, Angela's original name was Fatima Karimkhani. During the Iranian Revolution, her family fled the country to Germany, and after she reached adulthood, she changed her name to Angela and moved to Texas in 1995, where she befriended and married a man named Rayford Tyler Jr. But that was just a scam to get US citizenship. It's called marriage fraud and it's actually illegal. But she wasn't done yet. She then moved to California and began working as a stripper at a joint called the Candy Cat. There she drew in another man named Dion Harkness and tried to marry him, despite not being legally separated from her first husband yet. That's also illegal. She started using his last name despite not doing a legal name change yet, and then began accusing Dion of abusing her, something he adamantly denied. Dion was actually a judge in the area, and the accusations were enough to get him disbarred and taken off the bench. Now with no job and his law degree being utterly useless, Dion was in a terrible spot. After another argument with Angela, Dion checked into a hotel room on the other side of town and committed suicide. Although she was investigated, she somehow never got charged with anything and then moved back to Texas, where she went back into the stripping business. In 2001, while she was on the job, she met with a big shot at Wells Fargo Bank named Gary D. Jones. Jones, who was already married, ended up moving in with Angela. From then on, they'd write fraudulent checks and take out loans, both in the names of their relatives, to fund quote-unquote investments of theirs. It was in their love shack in 2002 that they concocted a plan to strike it rich with their ill-gotten gains. They'd start a NASCAR Xfinity Series team, and call it Angela's Motorsports. I'm not exactly sure why this was the scam they chose, but they apparently knew what they were doing. They tapped Harold Hawley to be the crew chief and Mike McLaughlin to be their driver, both of which were established veterans. They even arranged to have Grade A equipment purchased from Robert Yates while that team was at the height of their success. And that wasn't the end of it. They had a sponsorship deal through Wired Flyer, an online travel agency, and when they showed up to Daytona testing in February of 2003, they were quickest on the board. Everything seemed perfect, even if the people running the show had a sordid past. But then crew chief Harold Hawley did something that no one in this series has ever done before. Something so clever and calculating you'd wonder why nobody ever thought of it up to this point. He went to the sponsor's website and found out it was just a single travel agency, not a chain. He even called their office to confirm this. He then goes up to Mike McLaughlin and tells him, "Hey man, I don't think our sponsor is real." As it would turn out, the agreement Wired Flyer had with Angela's Motorsports was just to cover travel expenses. They didn't actually pay any money to the team outright. Not too surprisingly, those first checks to Robert Yates bounced and he took all of his equipment back, suffering minimal losses. The team didn't even make it to Speed Weeks, as everybody was let go with no prior notice. But Mike McLaughlin, to his eternal credit, decided to sell off some of his equipment he owned to give his crew members 2 weeks worth of pay out of his own pocket. However, karma didn't repay the favor, and his racing career was essentially done. He'd go on to be a test driver for Joe Gibbs. But that's not where this insanity ends. Shortly after the team went belly up, Wells Fargo fired Jones after it appeared that he had been diverting company money to a stock car scheme. And in 2004, Jones was arrested for embezzlement and fraud, and Angela is also in the hot seat. But she could look at less time if she testifies against Jones. She agrees to the deal, but before Jones would go on trial, she fled the country. After a 3-year-long manhunt, she was finally arrested in 2007 in the United Arab Emirates and sent back to the US. She ended up being sentenced to just 3.5 years in federal prison. Seems to me like she got off pretty light considering the damage she did and the cost it took to apprehend her. After she got out of jail, she still was not done. She popped back up again in 2018 for an assault charge in Georgetown, Texas. She was released a week later, and honestly, who knows where her story's going to end at this point. Angela, Hurley, Big Daddy, Bobby Ginn, and others in this story aren't the first people to get greedy and decide to take advantage of NASCAR teams, and they certainly won't be the last. With bigger and better sponsorships moving in and costs continuing to mount, this series unfortunately will have plenty of ammunition for the future. Anyway, I'm Slapshoes, and I'm sorry you had to watch this.